What's going on? Everybody okay?
Everyone remembers the moment, but almost no one remembers how it felt. The room was laughing, relaxed, predictable, like it always is at the Academy Awards 2022. A joke lands, people smile, cameras cut, nothing unusual. And then something shifts. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. A pause that lingers half a second too long. A look that doesn't match the smile. Then movement. Calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. He walks onto the stage, not rushed, not angry, just focused. And then it happens. The sound cuts through the room, sharp, immediate, impossible to take back. For a moment, no one reacts. Not the audience, not the cameras, not even the person standing in front of him. Because it doesn't register as real. It feels like something slipped out, something that wasn't supposed to be seen. People later called it a mistake, a loss of control, a bad decision in a heated moment. But that explanation never fully settles. Because nothing about that moment feels sudden. It feels familiar in a way people can't quite explain. Like something that had been building quietly, invisibly for years. And once you notice that feeling, it becomes hard to ignore. The smile that stays just a bit too long. The laughter that feels slightly forced. The energy that doesn't quite match the situation. Small details, easy to dismiss on their own, but together they start forming a pattern. And suddenly, that moment on stage doesn't feel like a break from character anymore. It feels like the first time the character slipped. For decades, Will Smith wasn't just a movie star, he was something rarer. Someone people trusted. He was the guy who made everything feel lighter. The energy was always the same, confident but approachable, funny but controlled, successful but still relatable. From the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air to global blockbusters, his presence carried a kind of consistency that audiences rarely question. He didn't just perform, he reassured. Interviews, red carpets, talk shows, it all blended into one clear image. Positive, disciplined, in control. Even his personal life seemed to follow that same pattern, open enough to feel real, but never messy enough to feel unstable. And over time, that image became more than just branding. It became expectation. People didn't just like him, they believed in him. But the problem with that kind of image is not how it's built, it's how much it has to be maintained. Because staying that consistent for that long doesn't just take effort. It takes control. And control, when pushed far enough, doesn't disappear. It cracks. And when it does, it rarely looks the way people expect. Long before the fame, before the red carpets and the carefully controlled image, there was a different kind of pressure shaping Will Smith. It didn't come from Hollywood. It started much earlier, inside a home where conflict wasn't something you confronted, it was something you avoided. He has spoken in the past about growing up around a strict father, where tension could rise quickly and unpredictably. And in that kind of environment, you don't learn to fight back. You learn to adapt. You learn to read the room. You learn how to diffuse a situation before it escalates. For him, that meant becoming the one who could make people laugh. The one who could shift the mood before things turned uncomfortable. At first, it seems harmless, even admirable. But over time, that instinct doesn't disappear. It evolves. What starts as a coping mechanism becomes a pattern. And that pattern becomes identity. As his career began to take shape, that same instinct followed him. On screen, it worked perfectly. Charisma, humor, timing, it all felt natural. But off-screen, the same behavior started serving a different purpose. Not just entertaining, but managing perception. Keeping things smooth. Avoiding tension. Making sure no moment went too far off script. And the more successful he became, the more valuable that control seemed. People didn't just expect him to be likable, they relied on it. Studios invested in it. Audiences trusted it. And slowly, without any clear moment where it began, being liked stopped feeling optional. It started feeling necessary. There's a difference between being yourself and being the version of yourself that people respond to best. And over time, that line can blur. especially when the rewards for maintaining that version are constant. Success, approval, admiration, all tied to a specific way of showing up. The energy, the smile, the confidence, always consistent, always controlled. But consistency at that level doesn't happen by accident. It takes awareness. It takes discipline. And sometimes, it takes suppression. Because not every emotion fits the image. Not every reaction aligns with expectations. And when those moments appear, they don't get expressed. They get managed, adjusted, pushed aside. From the outside, it looks effortless. But internally, it creates tension. Small at first, barely noticeable. The kind you can ignore. The kind you tell yourself is just part of the process. But over time, those small adjustments add up. Every moment of restraint, every time you choose the acceptable response over the honest one, it builds. And the more you build that system, the harder it becomes to step outside of it. Because stepping outside doesn't just risk a bad moment. It risks everything that system was designed to protect. At some point, the performance isn't something you turn on. It's something you live inside. And when that happens, a new problem starts to form. Not visible, not obvious, but real. The question is no longer how others see you. It becomes something much more uncomfortable. If you've spent years refining the version of yourself that the world responds to, what's left underneath it? And more importantly, do you still know how to access it? For a long time, the system held. The image stayed intact. The performance worked. But certain dynamics have a way of exposing things that success can hide. And one of the most important of those dynamics in Will Smith's life has always been his relationship with Jada Pinkett Smith. From the outside, it looked unconventional, open, even progressive at times. They spoke publicly about honesty, about growth, about redefining what a marriage could look like. But beneath that openness, there were moments that felt harder to interpret. Moments where the tone didn't quite match the words, where the energy between them seemed slightly out of sync. Not dramatic, not explosive, just enough to make people pause. Then came the situation that brought those subtle tensions into full view. The entanglement, conversation, involving August Alsina, unfolded publicly on Red Table Talk. On the surface, it was framed as transparency. A difficult conversation handled openly. But what stood out to many viewers wasn't just what was said. It was how it was said. The pacing, the pauses, the expressions. And most of all, his reaction. He laughed at certain moments, nodded along, stayed composed. But the laughter didn't fully land. It felt measured, controlled, almost like it arrived a second too late. As if it had been chosen rather than felt. That moment didn't create the tension. It revealed it. Because what people were seeing wasn't just a complicated relationship. It was a contrast. On one side, someone willing to confront uncomfortable truths directly. On the other, someone who had spent years mastering the ability to smooth them over. And when those two approaches meet, something interesting happens. One reflects what the other might be avoiding. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but inevitably. Some observers believe that this dynamic brought clarity. That it allowed both of them to express parts of themselves that might otherwise stay hidden. Others see it differently. They argue that the openness only made the imbalance more visible. That one person seemed grounded in difficult honesty, while the other appeared to be holding on to control. There is no single way to interpret it, and no confirmed explanation that fully captures what was happening beneath the surface. But what is clear is that something shifted in how people perceived him. Because for the first time, the version of him that always felt stable began to look uncertain. Not in a dramatic way, but in small, consistent details. The way he responded, the way he carried himself, the way certain emotions seemed to pass through a filter before being expressed. It didn't feel like a breakdown. It felt like exposure. Like the gap between who he is and who he presents had become visible, even if only for a moment. And once that gap is seen, it's hard to unsee. Because it raises a different kind of question. Not about the relationship itself, but about what it reveals. If someone has spent years maintaining control, avoiding conflict, shaping every response to fit a certain image, what happens when they're placed in a situation where that control no longer works the same way? When honesty isn't optional, and the usual tools don't quite apply. At that point, the issue is no longer about perception. It becomes something deeper. Something internal. And that's where things start to change. After that moment, something subtle but important began to shift. Not a dramatic collapse, not a headline scandal, but a pattern that became harder to ignore. The reactions, the expressions, the timing of his responses. Small details, but consistent enough to stand out. In interviews and public appearances, Will Smith still maintained the same composure, the same controlled energy. But now, there were moments where that control felt visible. Not seamless, but managed. And once people started noticing it, they couldn't quite unsee it. The conversation on Red Table Talk became a reference point. Not because of the situation itself, but because of what it seemed to reveal. His laughter in that moment, widely shared and discussed, didn't read as natural to everyone. Some viewers described it as resilience, a way of navigating an uncomfortable situation with composure. Others saw something different. A kind of restraint. As if the reaction being shown was not the first one that came up, but the one that was chosen. There is no confirmed way to interpret that moment, and no definitive explanation for what he was feeling internally. But the contrast between expression and emotion became part of the conversation. Around the same time, deeper layers of his personal experiences started to surface more openly. In his memoir Will, he reflects on the pressure of needing to be seen a certain way, the fear of conflict, and the effort it took to maintain control in situations where he felt vulnerable. He describes moments of insecurity, of questioning his own reactions, of holding back impulses that didn't align with the image he had built. These are not presented as dramatic revelations, but as gradual acknowledgments of an internal struggle that had been there for a long time. When you place those reflections next to the public moments, a pattern starts to form. Not a clear narrative, but a tension. The more he speaks about control, the more visible that control becomes. The more he emphasizes composure, the more people begin to look for what might be underneath it. And that doesn't necessarily mean there is something hidden or unresolved. But it does shift how the behavior is perceived. What once felt natural starts to feel intentional. What once felt effortless starts to feel maintained. Some people interpret this as growth. The process of becoming more self-aware, more open, more willing to confront uncomfortable truths. Others interpret it as strain. The difficulty of holding together multiple versions of oneself in different contexts. There is no single answer that fully explains it. But the coexistence of these interpretations adds weight to the situation. Because it suggests that what's being observed is not a single moment, but a developing pattern. And patterns, especially psychological ones, rarely resolve on their own. They tend to build. Quietly, steadily, often without a clear turning point. Until something changes. Not suddenly, not out of nowhere, but as the result of everything that came before. At that stage, the question is no longer whether there is tension. It's how much of it has accumulated, and how long it can be contained. At this point, the conversation begins to shift. It's no longer just about public moments or relationship dynamics. It moves into something more difficult to define. Identity. Because when you look at the pattern closely, the issue doesn't seem to be a single event or a specific situation. It starts to look like something broader. A gradual tension between who someone is expected to be and who they actually feel like underneath that expectation. For Will Smith, that tension may not have appeared all at once. It may have built slowly, reinforced over years of consistency, success, and control. Maintaining a public image at that level requires more than discipline. It requires alignment. The version of yourself that the world sees has to match, at least closely enough, the version you can live with internally. But when that alignment starts to slip, even slightly, the effort required to maintain it increases. Small adjustments become constant corrections. Natural reactions become filtered responses. And over time, that process can create distance. Not from the audience, but from yourself. Because if every moment is being evaluated before it's expressed, it becomes harder to know what the unfiltered version would even look like. This is where the idea of pressure becomes incomplete. It's easy to say that public scrutiny or media attention creates stress. But pressure alone doesn't explain the kind of shift that people began to notice. Because pressure can be managed when the foundation is stable. What complicates things is when the foundation itself becomes uncertain. When the identity being presented is no longer something that feels fully grounded, but something that has to be maintained actively, almost continuously. Some observers suggest that this is a natural part of long-term fame. That anyone in that position would eventually experience some form of identity conflict. Others believe it's more specific. That in this case, the emphasis on being liked, being controlled, being consistent, may have created a structure that left little room for anything outside of it. There is no confirmed way to measure that internally, and no direct statement that fully defines what he was experiencing at that time. But the outward signs point to a growing complexity. Because once the question of identity enters the picture, everything else changes. Reactions are no longer just responses to situations. They become indicators. Signals of alignment or misalignment. And when those signals start to vary, even slightly, they draw attention. Not because they are extreme, but because they contrast with what came before. Consistency makes change more visible. And in this case, even small shifts carried weight. At a certain point, maintaining the balance between image and identity becomes less about control and more about endurance. How long can it be sustained? How much adjustment can be made before something gives? Not in a dramatic way, not in a single moment, but through accumulation. Because when the gap between the external and the internal continues to widen, the system holding it together doesn't collapse immediately. It tightens. It compensates. It holds until it doesn't. When the moment finally came, it didn't arrive with warning. It didn't look like build-up or escalation. It looked simple. A joke. A reaction. A decision. But when you place it against everything that came before, it starts to read differently. The stage at the Academy Awards 2022, the exchange with Chris Rock, the brief pause before he stood up. On the surface, it can be interpreted in many ways. A defensive response. A misjudgment. An emotional overreaction. Different observers have offered different explanations, and there is no single confirmed reason that fully accounts for it. But what makes the moment stand out is not just the action itself. It's how complete it felt. There was no hesitation in the movement. No visible internal debate. Just a clear transition from sitting to standing, from observing to acting. That kind of clarity, especially in a public setting, doesn't usually come from nowhere. Some believe it was about protecting someone he cared about. Others suggest it reflected a deeper frustration that had been building over time. There are also those who see it as a combination of both, a moment where multiple pressures converged into a single action. Each interpretation highlights a different aspect, but none of them fully closes the question. What adds to the complexity is what happened immediately after. He returned to his seat, the environment shifted, and the tone of the room changed. The energy was no longer controlled or predictable. It was uncertain. And in that uncertainty, something else became visible. Not just the act, but the emotion behind it. Not filtered, not adjusted, not aligned to expectation. Raw, direct, and difficult to categorize. For someone whose public identity had long been associated with composure and control, that contrast carried weight. Some analysts argue that this was a loss of control, a moment where the usual mechanisms didn't function as intended. Others view it as something more deliberate, not planned in advance, but not entirely accidental either. A point where the effort to maintain a certain version of self reached its limit. There is no verified explanation that defines it conclusively, and any interpretation remains speculative. But what can be observed is the shift in perception that followed. Because after that moment, the image that had remained consistent for so long was no longer stable. It didn't disappear, but it changed. The confidence people associated with it became more complex. The familiarity became less certain. And the gap that had been gradually forming between expectation and reality became harder to ignore. What had once been subtle was now visible. Not as a conclusion, but as a question. And that may be the most accurate way to understand it. Not as a single event with a clear cause, but as a point of release. A moment where the accumulated tension, the controlled responses, the managed reactions, all gave way at once. Not necessarily by intention, and not necessarily with full awareness, but in a way that made the underlying pattern impossible to overlook. After everything that happened, the easiest way to understand it would be to reduce it to a single explanation. A mistake. A moment of anger. A lapse in judgment. But the more you look at the full picture, the harder it becomes to settle on just one answer. Because what unfolded wasn't isolated. It was connected. To patterns that had been building over time. To behaviors that had been consistent for years. To a system that, for a long time, appeared to work perfectly. Will Smith didn't suddenly become someone different that night. At least, there is no clear evidence to suggest that. What changed was visibility. The separation between image and reaction, between control and expression, became noticeable in a way it hadn't before. And once that separation is seen, it reframes everything that came before it. Moments that once felt natural begin to feel structured. Reactions that once felt effortless begin to feel considered. Some people interpret that shift as a fall. Others see it as exposure. And there are also those who view it as something more neutral, a reminder that public personas are, by nature, constructed. There is no confirmed perspective that fully defines what it means, and it likely depends on how each person understands the balance between identity and expectation. But what remains consistent across all interpretations is the sense that the situation is more complex than it first appeared. Because when someone spends years refining a version of themselves that the world responds to, the line between performance and identity can become difficult to trace. Not intentionally, not deceptively, but gradually. And when that line begins to blur, even small disruptions can carry disproportionate weight. Not because they are extreme, but because they reveal the structure behind them. Maybe the most accurate conclusion is not about what happened in that moment, but about what it represents. Not a clear answer, but an open question. About how much of what we see is real, how much is shaped, and how long that balance can be maintained before it shifts. And in that sense, the moment doesn't close the story. It complicates it. Because it suggests that what people witnessed wasn't necessarily a change. It may have been clarity. And clarity, especially when it arrives unexpectedly, rarely feels comfortable. It lingers. It raises questions. And it leaves behind something unresolved. If you've made it this far, you probably realize this story isn't as simple as it first seemed. And that's exactly the point. Some stories aren't about clear answers, they're about the questions that stay with you after the video ends. If you're interested in stories that go deeper than headlines, that look past the surface and explore what's really going on underneath, then this is just the beginning. There are more stories like this, more patterns that don't quite make sense at first, but start to connect the closer you look. So if that's something you want to explore, you can stay here, watch the next one, and see what stands out to you next.